Today's scripture is from John, chapter 21, verses 1 through 8. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to him, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. The word of the Lord for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
My Bible is starting to wear out. It's dirty. Looks like from where I grabbed it, I don't know what. I've got tape on it. Some of the pages are torn, got marks in it, highlights in it. I could buy a new one, but it wouldn't be the same. It just wouldn't be the same. Maybe you've got something like that. Mine happens to be a New Revised Standard Version. The New International Version is in the pews, and I invite you to go ahead and grab one out if you would. Turn to John's Gospel in the New Testament, chapter 21. Chapter 21. John chapter 21. It's the last chapter of John's Gospel. That's the New International Version. Mine is the New Revised Standard Version. Some of you probably grew up reading the King James Version. Did anybody grow up reading the King James Version of the Bible? Oh, there's some. Okay, good. That was the Bible that was used from 1611 to 1946 primarily. 335 years. Then the Revised Standard Version came out in 1946. Some of us grew up with that. The New Revised Standard Version came out in the 1980s. But you see the same story that Marcia read, which is this out of the King James. After these things, Jesus shewed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias, and on this wise shewed he himself. There were together Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and two other of his disciples. Simon Peter, then this is what it says. Simon Peter saith unto them, I go a-fishing. What does it say in your New International Version? I'm going out to fish. Here's what I think happened. The New Revised Version scholars who put it together and the New International Version scholars who put it together have tried to put something that we would understand. And sometimes they flattened out the language. I think I go a-fishing is way better than I'm going fishing. I go a-fishing. That sounds just good. I go a-fishing. That phrase, I go a-fishing. Have you ever heard of it? I mean, even those of you who grew up with the King James Version, did you ever Clock that. I go a-fishing. No one talks that way. They do in Tennessee? Exactly. I came across that phrase, I go a-fishing. It was the title of a sermon that I saw years and years ago. The Iliff School of Theology, there's a library. It was built in 1892, the school itself, and then they built a library some years later. It is 3 stories high, which is about as high as the sanctuary. I think the sanctuary is 35, 36 feet. What is it, Chuck? Do you know? It's about that high, maybe even higher. So it's got 3 stories, and it's probably 3 times as big as the sanctuary. So I'm just wanting you to picture how big the library is at Iliff. And then the first, second, and third floors are basically books, magazines, articles, things like that. In the basement is where the archive rooms are. You know what archive rooms are. That's where they held all the photographs and the paintings. There were robes in there from past presidents. And there were all these boxes and boxes of files of presentations from the professors, sermons, audio tapes, cassette tapes, all the way through the years and years that Iliff had been there. And that's what was in the archives. So I went into the archives once, and I went into this room. It wasn't very big. It's probably as big as this little square right in here. And there was a round table in there. And then I sat at the round table, and I asked the librarian, these are the boxes that I would like to see. They brought the boxes out to me. I opened the boxes, and in there were files. And some of the files were from a professor. His name was Dr. Charles Milligan. Now, you don't know Charles Milligan, but he was an influential person at Iliff. And he had this file of sermons. And I thought to myself as a young pastor, I need to steal some good sermons. And so I went and I opened it up, and I saw this one sermon, I go a-fishing. And I wondered, what in the world is that? I'd never heard that before. I go a-fishing. I can't remember the rest of the sermon, but I remembered that phrase because I thought it was so unusual. Now, here's why it's unusual. Here's why it's unusual. Last week, we talked about chapter 20 of John. You remember it. Peace, purpose, power, right? We talked about that. And we talked about it in light of that story where the disciples are meeting in that room. They're scared and cowering, and they're locked inside a room, and Jesus appears in the room, and he says, peace. And then Thomas puts his hand into Jesus' side. That story is one of the most amazing stories. How could it not be? A dead person appearing inside a locked room. People putting their hands in his side. That is the story of stories. That is the most amazing story. That story is a one in the history of humankind story, right? And the very next story, Peter says, I go a-fishing. You've got to be kidding me. After that, I go a-fishing. And here's the kicker, I think. Simon Peter saith unto them, I go a-fishing. They say unto him, we also go with thee. We also go with thee? Who talks that way? I love that. We lost something when we flattened it out and tried to make it understandable for us, right? I go a-fishing. We also go with thee. I love that. Well, here's the kicker. This is one I want to tell you. This is one I want to share with you. At the end of John chapter 20, it sounds like this. You know it, you've read it, but I wanted to share it with you. At the end of chapter 20, it sounds like this. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing, you may have life in his name. If you all have your Bibles, do this. Good. That is the end of a gospel. That's the way a gospel should end. Like that. You may have life. That's the way it ended originally. And what happened was someone 20 years later put that appendix on there. Postscript. You've written letters. You ever written letters and you wrote the whole thing and then you thought, after you signed it, oh, I got to put something on there. Have any of you done that ever? Do you put P.S., P period S period? Oh, I forgot to say this. That's what chapter 21 is. It's a postscript to us. It's a postscript to us. And here's the thing. When you read chapter 21, and you go back and read it at home, when you read chapter 21, you will see the echoes from the Gospel of John and the other Gospels, because most scholars believe that the Gospel of John, chapter 21, was written 10 to 20 years after the original ending of the Gospel of John. 10 to 20 years after. So around 120 to 130 of the Common Era. And here's the thing that we sometimes forget. From 66 to 136, the early Christian church was being hunted. They were being hunted down. People were being thrown to the lions and burnt at the stake and dipped in tar and lit on fire. They were having all these different things happen to them. And they had been waiting for the second coming of Jesus since the time of around 35 of the Common Era. 90 years had passed. Nothing had happened. They were becoming distraught and disappointed and distressed, defeated. And the person who wrote that appendix, that postscript, chapter 21, that person wanted the church, the early church, to know this is what's important. This is what's important. These are the things that are important. And so goes back through the Gospel of John and pulls out these different stories, and the Gospel of Luke. He pulls out these different stories and he shares them again to remind them of what they knew about Jesus. And you can tell that they're echoes, just like I told the kids, because this is what you find in that chapter 21. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples didn't know that it was Jesus. In the Gospel of John, just a few chapters earlier, Mary goes to the tomb. She sees the gardener. She does not recognize him, right? In the Gospel of Luke, the two are walking on the road to Emmaus, and they do not recognize Jesus. This is an echo of that story, of those stories. You go down a little bit further. Jesus says to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" After the disciples had gone fishing. They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat and you will find some." It is an echo of the story out of Luke. At the very beginning, when Jesus goes to get these fishermen to be followers, they are fishing, but they haven't caught anything. Do you remember that story? You keep going down. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. Do you remember a story about Peter trying to walk on the water? Do you remember that story? It is an echo of that story. Keep going. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." The net was not torn. Jesus said, come and have breakfast. Come and have breakfast. It is an echo of that Last Supper where Jesus invites the disciples to come and have a meal with him. They keep going. When they had finished the breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He does it 3 times. Do you remember that Peter denied Jesus 3 times? It is an echo of that story. It just keeps going on. These echoes that this person wrote, that was the important piece for that community. That was the important piece for that community. For us, today, we're going to have an echo of that meal that they shared. Now, in the beginning, I have not been to Rome. Have any of you been to the catacombs in Rome? Some of you have got to go. I read this yesterday. One of the earliest frescoes that has been found in the catacombs is a painting of people sharing a meal. The meal has a person who is breaking bread, sharing it, ready to share it. There's a chalice on the table, and there's a plate with fish on it. Is that true? Here's what they say. This is what some people say. That in the initial communion services, people would have bread, they would have wine, and they would have fish. But when the church spread into northern Macedonia, northern Greece, away from the ocean, that there were no fish available. And so the communion elements went down to bread and wine. I don't know if that's true, but it sounds plausible to me. How would you get fish if you were somewhere out you'd have to go fishing. And sometimes you get skunked. And people would say, what are we going to do now? Let's have the bread and wine. That makes sense to me. This echo, I think about Rachel Held Evans. She had been this conservative evangelical person, and then the last couple of years she became Episcopalian, and the centerpiece of that Episcopalian ritual is the Eucharist, or the Great Thanksgiving, or the Lord's Supper, or communion. That became very important to her, and I thought about Karen Olivito, our bishop. She said when she was a young woman, she knew she was different from others. Her sexuality was different. She felt like she was apart from other people, but she felt that in communion, she became one with people. It was important to her. Today, we're going to celebrate the Last Supper, communion, the Eucharist, maybe that breakfast that Jesus shared with his disciples on the shore when he said, come and have some fish. I think it is part of who we are to celebrate this, to remember that we are part of something so much bigger than just us, and that we are connected with these people through the generations, through the millennia, who've been sharing this meal together. Amen.